Hello, welcome to AT&T ThreatTraq for August 18th, 2015. This program provides network security highlights, discussion, and countermeasures for cyber threats. Today we're joined by Josh Lackey. And Josh, it's been some time since you've been here. Welcome back. Maybe you can tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. I'm a researcher in our security group. So what we do is we essentially try to break things. The things we try to break, the things we try to think about are about 10 years in the future. So, I mean, I guess not the things I try to break. The things I try to break exist now. But the things we try to fix, you know, the ideas my group tries to think about are about 10 years in the future. And so it's a security research functionality here at AT&T.
All right, great. Well, welcome, and we look forward to talking a little bit about the here and now and the future with you in a while here. We're also joined by John Hogobom. Welcome, John.
Thank you. Here again.
Here again. And Matt Kaiser.
Hi,
Welcome,
Brian.
Matt. I'm Brian Rexroad, and first, I guess what we're going to talk about here is some USB exploits. And
yeah, so, you know, we've talked about, like, in the past, we've talked about all kinds of different USB exploits with particularly thumb drives. So, you know, there was a while back, there was the real simple auto run one. If you put a thumb drive in and the old Windows would see there was an auto run on there, it would run and execute whatever that auto run said. This is a new vulnerability. It's actually in the Mount Manager service. I guess first of all, I should mention it's CVE 2015-1769. That's the actual vulnerability ID in the Common Vulnerability Exposure Database. Microsoft's patched it under MS15-085, and it does impact all versions of Windows. The basic gist of this is if you put a thumb drive in and it triggers an exploit in the Mount Manager component when it's trying to process symbolic links. So if you can, you know, have a specially crafted symbolic link on the thumb drive, you can actually just have remote execution occur by putting a thumb drive in, which is always the real nasty thing, because if you could get physical access to a machine and just insert the thumb drive, you can install your malware implant on there. So this is being exploited in the wild. I'm not sure to what degree, but there is a vulnerability, or there's a patch available that Microsoft pushed out in the last Microsoft Tuesday patch. So people should be aware of that and make sure that they patch. I guess the other thing I wanted to mention is it is reminiscent a little bit of the .lnk vulnerability from like 2010 timeframe that Stuxnet used. So that's kind of interesting. But that one was a little bit more severe. It was a worse one because you could actually do the remote execution, or you could do a remotely exploitable by just having like on a web page with a .lnk or something. Whereas this, you really need to have the thumb drive be inserted, the Mount Manager process, try to mount the thumb drive and then trigger it. The good thing is Microsoft did also add a event log type in. So if somebody tries to insert a thumb drive that tries to do this exploit, they're logging an event log record now, a specific type for that, which is good. So now you have something, if you are recording, you know, centrally harvesting all of your event log data from all your different systems, you could use that as a data point to go look for in your security analysis.
that should be helpful. I mean, you've got to dig out through all the other events that are in there.
That's the thing. There's some things that just generate tons of events, right? That's the problem with the Windows event recorder in general, but it is there. So it's one of those things to look for. Especially, I would say, if you have point of sale type devices a lot in your enterprise or in your whatever corporate environment, that would be something I would be worried about, particularly because there's probably lots of occasions where you have foot traffic coming in or around point of sale terminals, and if they do have USB ports exposed on those devices, that could be a potential avenue for this to occur.
So go ahead,
I was going to say, I'd even say certain kiosks have USB exposed for, if they're like, you know, photo print kiosks or something you could see in a store. If you're supposed to walk up and put a USB stick into it, it's going to be affected by this bug.
Yeah.
You probably want to patch first.
Yeah. So I was just going to ask a question about some good countermeasures. And I mean, obviously guarding the device. I mean, one of the immutable rules of security is that if you grant somebody physical access to your equipment, you have no security. It's theirs, right? So that's, I think, kind of a premise of this. I guess if it is a point of sale terminal, should we put glue in the USB drive?
Well, I mean, I guess it depends on what kind of point of sale terminals you have, right? If they are Windows based, and they're actually running locally the code as opposed to some kind of remote type of connection, then you would want to be concerned about if there are USB ports exposed and whatnot, and try to plug them up, so to speak, in some way so that people could not gain access without having to really take some extra measures to do that.
And is there a patch associated with this to actually fix it? You mentioned that the event logging.
Yeah,
there is a patch
so there is a
available
patch. The MS15-085 fixes this vulnerability, but just in case, they decide to add an event log type for this, so that even after you're patched, if somebody does try to exploit this, you will get some indication that somebody tried, which is a good thing to know.
Perhaps if you have other systems that haven't been patched yet, and you see the event log and places that have been patched, you want to start looking a little more closely.
Yeah, that would be an alarm bell. Yeah.
Okay, well, very good, John. Thanks very much. It seems like everything, has an angle for denial of service attacks.
Yep.
And this isn't one that I would have perhaps thought of, but tell us about it.
I had actually thought about this one for a while. And it turns out someone actually did the legwork, so good on them. This is a paper that was presented at the Usenix Woot conference. It's a great acronym. I can't remember what it stands for, but it has something to do about offensive techniques or something like that. But the idea is, BitTorrent, it's a UDP protocol, and it's got lots of little sub-protocols you can speak to, and the researchers in this case took a look at each one of those and tried to sort of judge them on whether or not you can use them for a reflective denial of service attack, which our viewers will know is a denial of service attack where you spoof the source address to a UDP connection, and the traffic that gets generated from the response goes back to the target. Turns out there's several protocols that you can do this within BitTorrent. There's the MUTP, which is like a micro transaction protocol, transport protocol, which is, I thought it was sort of interesting from a protocol perspective. It's a little bit like TCP over UDP, where they're trying to do some of the same kind of connection, and they do a handshake. It's a two-phase handshake. It's not a three-phase handshake, and I'm not sure what the point of that is, because the three-phase handshake is what makes TCP less, susceptible to these kind of reflection attacks. It actually makes MUTP a little more susceptible to these kind of attacks because you can use them to generate that handshake response. So they go through a couple protocols: MUTP, the DHT, which is distributed hash table, which is one of those famous features of BitTorrent that allows you to find other folks who have the same files as you. There's a message stream encryption protocol, and then there's BT Sync, which is a way of synchronizing files using BitTorrent. They measured the amount of amplification. They said you average about 50 times the amount of traffic you put in, you get out, and up to 120 times, I believe, if you're using BT Sync. That one's a little different because you have to know some sort of key. Each user has their own key for BT Sync. Some people will put them online so people can share files more easily with them. You use those, you use them for amplification. So there's a lot of really cool details in the paper. They go into some of the math calculation and comparison of which of these sub-protocols is more valuable for reflection. But I think that the sum total of it is BitTorrent is now a vector for DDoS attacks. And it's hard to determine, because you get a lot of this UDP traffic and more normal, connecting out to a lot of different hosts. It may look to you like it's just regular BitTorrent traffic. In this case, it's not.
Right. So, we're going to be talking about yet another protocol that's being used in reflective attacks. Now, this isn't actually being used at this point. This is really understanding the potential. Is that correct?
As far as I know, it hasn't been seen in the wild yet. But with the description of the techniques, I wouldn't be surprised if it comes out in the next week or so.
Okay. We're going to have to keep an eye on that.
And I would think that gathering a list of devices that are going to reflect would be pretty trivial.
Very trivial, just by the nature of the protocol.
Join the network, join the peer-to-peer network, and you're gonna get a whole list of peers together that you could use to do your reflective attack. So it's interesting. No scanning required, really.
Okay. Well, BitTorrent's been around for a while. It'll be interesting to see if this isn't exactly something you can go out and just patch.
Right, it's true.
So it's going to be perhaps a little bit of a challenge.
Yep, it's in the protocol itself. It's not a single client. And actually, the writers of the paper said that some of the more popular clients are the ones that expose more of these features and are somewhat, therefore, more susceptible to being used for these kind of attacks. So that's interesting.
Okay. All right, well, Josh, let's go to you. And we talk a lot about vulnerabilities in this program and a number of facets of it, but I think you have a little bit of a new twist to it. So,
well, maybe an old to it actually, and it's incredible because what we're talking about, reflection DOS attacks and USB insert a key attack. I mean, this are we back in the 90s or something? And actually, that was literally what we're finding the last year. There's just been some incredible attacks against computer systems and components that we thought were actually addressed. I mean, we thought these things had been gone through with a fine-tooth comb for years and years, and we're still finding vulnerabilities everywhere. So,
well, I think you actually have a very good point. Sorry for the interruption, but I think a lot of that has to do with this transition to Internet of Things to some extent. I mean, the BitTorrent thing doesn't really fit that category, but some of these things where this Internet of Things is something I certainly embrace, but a lot of the devices, or even the manufacturers of those devices, the people developing software for it, are ones that don't have experience with the security ramifications. And in many cases, those devices are just being done on the cheap and not being prepared properly for connecting to the internet. And so I think that, in some respects, is one of the underlying causes for this sort of revisiting a lot of the problems that we thought had been addressed in the past. But forgive the interruption. Continue.
Certainly in the Internet of Things example, I mean, like with embedded systems, it's hard to upgrade them, right? I mean, it's hard to update them. So if you make a mistake, and obviously we all make mistakes because we're still talking about flaws in software from 30 years ago, right? So, I mean, this is like something that humans do. We're human. When AI comes and starts writing its own software, I guess things will probably change. But right now, yeah, so definitely for Internet of Things. I mean, you start installing a light bulb, and then it's like, well, how do I upgrade my light bulb when I find out how I have a security vulnerability in my light bulb, right? So, I mean, I guess it's hard for me to complain because this is what I do, and so it's like job security. But, when you think about, geez, we're deploying new stuff, and you come to find out this new stuff has just as many flaws as the old stuff. But, I mean, really my point, I mean, and I think this is actually very healthy. I think this is good that we're finding flaws in these types of components. I mean, it's not great. I wish there weren't those flaws, but the fact that we're finding them, that we're talking about them, we're warning people, I think that's a very good thing. One of the things my team does is we actually try to monitor sort of the hackers, right? We go to the different conferences and we, basically rarely speak, but we try to go to the more interesting talks that speakers give. And one of the things, I'm a radio guy. I like phones. I like radios. And I had seen this just recently, a conference in Germany, the Chaos Computer Camp, and they were giving a talk about Iridium phone service. And so this is satellite. This is like if you have a satellite phone, this is where you get your satellite phone service from. And I don't have any vulnerabilities to discuss in this component, but there are definitely a number of people who are looking at Iridium phone service. And they can do things like track you across the planet right now. So it's not like a vulnerability per se, but it certainly is a privacy leak. So there are issues that will probably be identified at some point. So, I mean, and this is just sort of the great example of this legacy component, right? Because it's a satellite. Actually, it's like 100 satellites orbiting above the Earth right now. I mean, they're all above us right now, and you can't upgrade them because you can't afford it. I mean, Iridium went broke, and I think the government purchased them. So how do you upgrade? So I think it's just a good example of if you deploy something in 20 years, it will definitely be hacked upon. So but like everything, right? It's not just satellites. It's our phones, it's our computers, it's components of our computers we didn't know weren't updated for 20 years. So.
Yeah, just I'm not sure how familiar folks are with Iridium, but I think I remember when that was being originally conceived. I think this was back in like the late 80s, and being deployed in the 90s. And like you said, I think the business case was a little bit lofty. Part of the problem is it requires so many satellites to be aloft, and it's like the cell network actually moving around you while you stand still on the ground somewhere in the middle of nowhere with a satellite phone.
But not geosynchronous?
Oh, no, they're not geosynchronous at all. It's low orbit, so they actually, in fact, you can sometimes see them in the sky. But cool. the situation with this, the reason I point that out is because this is actually in a time period where having a payload on a satellite that would be able to support over-the-air updates and that type of behavior would be, that would be a technology challenge in itself, let alone keeping all those devices up there.
Well, and of course the plan was to support them, but it just turns out to be ridiculously expensive to keep up 100 satellites in, low Earth orbit. It's just expensive. So,
well, part of it is the space plane never came about. That was.
I was promised flying cars. I don't know what happened to that, but I was definitely promised flying.
And jetpacks.
Well, they're going to be smart flying cars, nevertheless.
Oh, so, that's even worse. Hackable.
So, do you have another example that we can discuss here?
Well, there's the SSL bugs recently. I mean, we're talking about components, encryption that we really thought had been examined. And I'm not just talking about one SSL bug. Over the last 2 years, we've been talking about like multiple SSL bugs that have affected everybody.
About a half a dozen serious ones that have been identified, right?
Yeah, and it's one of those components where, like, personally, I was like, I'm not going to look there. I'm trying to find bugs. That stuff has been looked at so many times for so long. Why would I waste my time, right? And then these kids come along and boom, bugs. So.
Yep. As they do. Okay, so I guess at this point, let's go ahead and transition back to John here. And, let's, I guess, password cracking is, I guess it's one of the tricks of the trade.
Right. So yeah, we see that a lot with particularly nation-state actors. Once they get access to a machine inside a company's network, a lot of times one of the first tool sets they'll bring over is this tool, Mimikatz. Mimikatz was developed by a researcher for good purposes, intentionally, just proof of concept, to say, hey, there's this flaw here, but to kind of proof of concept thing. But in any event, Mimikatz is a tool that examines in-memory password hashes, and that it kind of proves that you can get the clear text back out of the password hashes from memory. You do need local administrative privileges in order to do that, though, to run that tool and get these password hashes out of memory. Another researcher here, I forget his name exactly, we have the link up here, he developed kind of, I guess he does a lot of pen testing, and he was trying to figure out a more efficient way to go about harvesting of credentials. So he wrote a tool called CredCrack that it's written in Python. So it actually is kind of developed to kind of run on a Linux platform in terms of your attack platform. So you run it with Python, you need Apache with PHP as well, because it uses a web server to actually deliver the exploit to the machine. So what it does is first it'll go and query the list of systems that you give it to see if they're actually listening on port 445 TCP, which is the SMB or whatever it is.
SMB,
port. Then it'll query that for a list of domain administrators, get that information. So it does need local admin rights in order to be able to do some of these functions in order to get some of this information. And then it sends a PowerShell command telling the remote system, connect back to my web server, grab this PowerShell script and run it, which runs Mimikatz in memory. So a lot of this all happens in memory, so it never drops to disk. So, antivirus may not pick it up unless, certain antiviruses will pick up in-memory stuff.
Well, and perhaps in a forensics analysis, if you're looking for the behavior that presence or having had that on disk, it's not going to show up.
Right. So in any event, it basically automates a lot of this functionality. I guess the one thing I would kind of say about this, and I haven't really tried it myself, is that there are some assumptions about local admin privileges maybe being the same across multiple systems. So if you're trying to do a sweep across many different systems, I don't think it gives you a lot of flexibility to provide like a list of different local admin accounts to try, because depending on how you're arranged in your network, it might not be as easy to utilize this tool from that perspective. But one of the things that is kind of interesting is if you can, if you are using Mimikatz on a machine with local admin privileges, a lot of places have administrative accounts that might execute certain things on all of their desktops, have some kind of domain admin that's kind of doing maintenance and whatnot, mechanized type of functions. And those will probably be in memory, so you can get those out, get those passwords, and then use, depending on how your domain is set up, use those to further your lateral movement across the company and take over additional machines and whatnot. So,
common attack strategy.
Yeah, that's the common attack strategy, right?
Yep.
So, interesting tool. I haven't tried it myself. I guess your mileage may vary with it, I guess is my interpretation looking at it. And based on how you have your environment set up, it may speed things up a little bit in terms of your pen testing.
Yeah, the article title says, domain administrator in 17 seconds. I guess that's a new record, or at least what you could potentially achieve with this tool?
Well, yeah, I mean, given, he basically gave an example, but it's a very small network of his own, right? And it's only got a couple of machines on it, and they were very simple, password hashes and whatnot in there. So, yes, if you had to do it all manually, it would take you more than 17 seconds probably. So I think it's just the automation is the only speed improvement here. It's not that his tool or the tools that he's using are operating fast. He's just eliminated you having to type in a lot of commands. Okay. You know what I mean?
So this may be valuable for pen testing, as you noted. But what are some recommended countermeasures?
It's a good question. I guess if you had good policies around watching event logs for Mimikatz type of artifacts in your event logs, that would be one way. I'm not quite sure if the author actually mentions that he's going to possibly post another blog post with some more information about how you can detect the presence of this maybe being utilized. I don't know. Did you have any other insight?
No,
okay.
I'm waiting for the article too.
Okay.
So let's keep our eyes peeled for that, because I think that's going to be an important aspect to this, is a means to be able to detect the presence of it, in the absence of having the opportunity to do a disk forensics in a case like that, and hopefully the opportunity to be able to prevent this from progressing, which it's obviously going to be difficult. Protecting against a escalation of rights to local administrators, one of those. I mean, sophisticated actors generally going to have 0 days that they can pull out of their repertoire to be able to do those things.
Right.
So it'll be interesting to see how this develops.
Okay.
So Matt, let's go to you. And I guess capturing stuff out of memory is one thing, but making it stay there is another.
Or making it show back up after you think you've cleaned off your laptop is even worse.
Persistence.
So this is an interesting feature that I'm just learning a little bit now. It made the news in a big way. Lenovo, who we remember was part of that whole Superfish debacle a couple months back, where they had installed some sort of unwanted software on their machines to take a look at what people were doing, and intercept HTTPS and things like that.
And that was that gray line between the monetizing the platform and perhaps discounting devices, but perhaps at least in some accounts they sort of cross that line. Right?
Well, it's whether or not you inform a user that this is going to be done and what the benefits and costs are. Right.
And your opportunity to remove it.
Exactly. Now, in this case, Lenovo has apparently got a tool that they're calling Lenovo Service Engine. And it's being installed, or it was being installed, from October of last year until April of this year on Lenovo desktops and laptops. On desktops, apparently it did very little. It would sort of, send a single identifier saying, first time you boot it up, great, you're good to go. But on the laptops, apparently it includes a little-known software called One Key Optimizer, which is sort of considered grayware to junkware. They were installing it using a method that is new in Windows 8 and 10. It's used the WPBT Windows Platform Binary Table. In short, it's a way for OEMs to install a Windows binary into their laptop firmware or desktop firmware, and if it ever gets removed from the system, if it's a Windows 8 or 10 machine, Windows will go retrieve it and install it for you. And this will occur on any Windows 8 or 10. So if I go and I wipe my OEM machine and I put my brand new Windows 10 license that I obtained completely out of bounds, this will be installed on my machine whether I like it or not.
That's crazy to me.
It's a little crazy. It is rootkit-like technology to me. Now there are legitimate reasons for this. I believe there are LoJack-like softwares that you could use this for. So if someone steals a laptop and does exactly that, it'll put the LoJack back on, figure out it's been stolen, and report home. And that's great. There's really good reasons for doing that. Lenovo has been shown that this is a problem. They've released a firmware patch that takes this out of the loop. This is not going to be happening anymore, and that's great.
Yeah, Josh.
I was just going to say, it's not so much that they're installing software that, you're not aware of, but it's the fact that, what type of security review has this component gone under? Can an attacker use this, right? So, I mean, it is installing software that I didn't know about, right? And that's one thing. But for me, the reason why that's important for me is because I'd like to know what type of security review this software component's gone under. And if it's doing some weird things, shoving files into my firmware, oh my God, that sounds like a hacker's dream, right? So, yeah, I mean, I'm not so mad that they're just installing stuff. I'm mad that they didn't tell us about it, where the vectors are going, right? I mean, anyway, that.
Yeah, and I guess in their defense, it's not clear what fine print may have disclosed some information about this or not. I guess Matt has a response.
Well, I was
to
going to
point.
say that Windows apparently has some sort of standards that vendors are supposed to agree to if you're going to use this feature. I'm not sure how they enforce that, but apparently Lenovo has said, we goofed. We did not abide by that.
I'm sure I'm being unfair when I say they didn't tell us, right? I'm sure somewhere on page 29 they informed us. So.
Yeah, that's a possibility.
So there's documents out there about the right way to do this. Apparently they have sort of best practices, and they say signing your code is a good one. I'm not sure if that means that if you're an OEM, you better make sure your code is signed, or Windows is actually going to validate that your code is signed. But where it is in the boot sequence, I find it hard to believe they could actually validate. They wouldn't connect to the internet and validate that this is signed and then make sure. You know what I mean? So
But I would think Windows, when it goes to pick it up out of firmware, right? He
Would
takes a
verify the
look at it and
signature.
says, "Oh, this is code signed, and I'm going to go check."
Yeah, but signed by
Windows
who?
would.
Signed by the creator of the software, signed by a certificate
Right? Is it a
chain.
trusted authority and whatnot? Right? I don't know. It's detail. I'm hoping that it's a trusted signer, but even then, that doesn't necessarily mean it's not impossible to go get your own code signing license.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Perhaps just to kind of roll this up into a ball here, I think the fact that it's so complex. I mean, here we are, security analysts, and we're debating how it could possibly be working or what security problems might exist associated with it. And it might be good, it might be bad, but I think that's fundamentally the issue, is that there's so much complexity, so many nuances, so many back channels that could exist within the tools that it's almost impossible to expect a layman to have a reasonable cognizance of the security of their platform in an environment like this. So somehow it needs to be simplified so that things are a little more, trustworthy and automatic, just in the essence of what's delivered to you.
Yeah.
We have some work to do, and it's like Josh said earlier. I think we have a little bit of job security. And in fact, if you look at the industry trends, there are a lot of organizations looking for people with cybersecurity expertise. So it's not just job security for the folks that are in it, but it's anybody that's looking for a challenging and engaging opportunity going forward.
We need these kids to start looking at security in computers. They want to do videos, and no, that's not fun. Computer security? No, if you don't have a job, seriously consider computer security.
Well, Josh, I know a small group of guys who do both computer security and videos, and that might be a way to get some people into the field.
Yeah, just a handful of us. Actually. All right, so let's take a look at the internet weather for the last week or so here, and this is going to look eerily like last week, but I have a few little twists to share with you. First of all, scam probes on port 53413 UDP. We talked about this last week. Again, this is associated with a backdoor Netis routers. Netis is actually, forgive me, it's a brand associated with a Chinese-made home router, and it apparently has this backdoor in the system. There's some public disclosure of that on the internet. Somebody had made this discovery and published a paper on the topic. It is a Chinese-made device. It's predominantly popular in most of the cases where we've seen this is in India and China, but they are available in the United States, and there's some available. You can buy them in the United States, and there's some of them out there. But nevertheless, most of the probes here are from a single source IP address, and it's associated with what's registered as a private customer in the United States, hosted by a US-based hosting provider. So this scanning activity occurs. It's very spiky in nature, and it's not real dense. It's not really aggressive, but it is certainly actually kind of aggressive in terms of the number of probes, but continues on. Next item here is scan probes on port 111 UDP, and this is associated with port mapper. Now this is a little bit interesting because last week we talked about probing activity on port 111 TCP. Now this port is actually registered both on the TCP and UDP to the same application, which was SON RPC, or actually an RPC remote procedure protocol. I think that actually gets used as a part of port mapper, which apparently can work on TCP and UDP. But the significance here, as we'll see in a moment, was, well, first of all, let's take a little closer look at the graph that we have. And in this case, what we're seeing is probing activity that basically spans back to around the end of July. So it's the last few weeks that we've seen this activity. And over the last, say a week or so here, a little bit, week and a half, we see an increase, which is the red line, an increase in the number of packets associated with this probing activity. And this actually looks like it may be associated with reflective denial of service attack activity. Now, I didn't make that connection when we were looking at this last week. Again, we were kind of focused on the TCP aspect of it, but we're certainly seeing some of that activity in this graph here, where when you start seeing probing activity with lots of packets relative to the number of flows, it suggests there's something more than reconnaissance taking place. So at the beginning, it looks like perhaps reconnaissance, looking for devices that are responding on this port, and then later on, perhaps reflective denial of service attack activity. Now, the inspiration for looking at it from this perspective is actually a blog that was posted by Level 3 Communications, peer of ours, and they identified, basically through similarly the way we do it, flow analysis, indications of reflective denial of service attacks using port mapper, and they did some more in-depth analysis in terms of the amount of amplification they were seeing and the prominence of this attack activity. So I think this is basically a credible paper. It doesn't provide a huge amount of details, but certainly lays out what they provided as basically an industry warning that this could grow in terms of an attack vector. Now, taking a look at it a little bit further, looking at the reflection activity, basically the amount of bits that are coming from port 111 UDP, what we see are targets in Brazil predominantly, and a few different countries in Europe. And our analysis, just taking a look at the number of sources that appear to be responding, we see on the order of a few thousand sources so far. So it's not as bad as some of the other situations that we've seen where there have been, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of sources. And that was my primary concern here when we started looking at this, is how many devices are out there that are responding to port mapper, and it appears that it might not be a huge number. So that's a positive sign so far. But we're going to still need to keep an eye on this, see how it develops, and determine what types of countermeasures might be necessary to protect against it. And as with other reflection attack activities, the DDoS mitigation service or a scrubbing service can scrub this out relatively easily, but you have to be subscribed to that service in order for that to work effectively.
Hey, Brian, is there a reason that anybody would actually need port mapper to be listening on the internet nowadays?
That's a very good question. I haven't dug in that deeply, but probably not.
IRC used to, I think even still today, a lot of IRC services try to ping you back on port mapper to do something.
I'll just repeat Josh's question and ask if we really need, do we need IRC?
What were you going to say, Josh?
This is 1990s again, guys. I mean, we're attacking port mapper. I mean, I think this just goes to my point where we've just got components. It's crazy to me. It's crazy to me.
Yeah. Well, Josh, you're getting me a little depressed here. We've been working on this for 20 years. We've had to make some progress.
It'd be interesting to fingerprint those 2,500 sources to see if there's a predominance of Sun machines, actually.
Certain types of machines,
Because
yeah.
older Sun always ran.
Exactly what I was thinking. I mean, it's got to be Solaris. I forget the fingerprinting. I just want to go talk to those guys. Why do you have Port Mapper listening on the internet? This isn't.
That's actually, and perhaps that's an activity we'll be able to perform and provide an update next week. Next item here, scan sources on port 21 TCP. This is kind of interesting. You know, it wouldn't be surprising to have folks, you know, scanning around the internet looking for FTP servers. Sometimes they can be, well, it's a place where you can find files if you're looking for files. In this particular case, it's a little bit subtle. There was not a significant increase in the number of probes, but certainly an increase in the number of sources doing that probing activity. And most of those sources, like the vast majority of those, perhaps around 90% of them, are actually in China. So it appears to be some coordinated activity around this. In fact, well, how else do you get a bunch of IP address scanning at the same time? There's some coordination around that. Curious that they were all located in China.
There's a few malware families out there that use FTP for exfiltration of data.
This is true.
So once they harvest credentials up, they'll FTP them out. And then we also know of some other APT actors that like to use open FTP servers for all of their shenanigans, I'll put it.
Yeah, so I mean, why set up your own server and have to pay for it if you can go out and find somebody else's that's not well protected and use it as a drop point? So that's actually a very good point, that sometimes when a site like this, an FTP server, even a website or something, it may not be compromised to attack that victim. It may end up being a part of or a participant in some other attack activity, and it helps to provide legitimacy from a connection standpoint. Like, so that doesn't surprise me that one of my desktops is connecting to an FTP server that's located in that cloud service somewhere, and yet it turns out it ends up being a cover for more nefarious activity that's taking place. Good point. Taking a look at the top 10 most probed ports at the top of the list, port 23, ooh, surprise. And port 22 following that, again, actually not a surprise at all. We see this, that we talked a little bit about the Internet of Things earlier, and these are, you know, devices that are offering telnet of all things. How about that one, Josh? You said we're in the 1990s. We've just jumped back into the 80s.
Yes, telnet is definitely 80s. I don't think we were even looking for it in the 90s. Who is still looking for these things? Here, tell me this. Are they finding it? That's what I really want to know. Are they still
absolutely.
finding it?
We'll show that to you in a little bit here. And then followed by port 443 TCP and 80 TCP, so digging around looking for those gray web servers.
Gray web servers, yeah.
And then we see some activity associated with the reflective denial service attack activity. That's 1900 UDP, followed by 445 TCP, always a steady on this one. 9200 TCP, that's associated with a proxy, I believe, if I remember correctly.
Did you discover that? I can't remember.
I'm going to have to double check that. Forgive me. I thought
it's very possible.
Yeah, I think it is a proxy activity.
I was on vacation last week.
And then 21320 TCP certainly is a proxy, and then followed by 10th on this list is 1433 TCP, which is Microsoft SQL database. So looking at the number of probes that we see on port 23 TCP, Telnet, we're looking at 60 days of data here. And, you know, we've seen a couple of pretty big spikes in the third week and the last week in July. And we're seeing a smaller spike in activity here. Curious to see this decay pattern. That's a pretty standard pattern of a botnet where they've been commanded to do that activity. And then as the participants complete their activity, it kind of declines. In terms of the amount of probing activity that you see. So we see a new surge of it here. Again, this is in terms of the number of probes that we're seeing on the network. And most of the probes are from, we're going to have to strike that. I don't think, actually in this case, this is correct. Most of these probes are actually from a single address in China. And as I was investigating this further, it looked like that same source on other days had been doing probing activity on port 21 TCP. That's FTP, which we had already talked about earlier, a little different context. Looking at the top 10 most sources doing the probing, at the top of the list in terms of the number of sources that are doing probing, port 23 TCP, this is Internet of Things devices that are being compromised. Not sure why they have Telnet exposed to the internet, but they do. Followed by 445 TCP, 2715 UDP, 22 TCP, again, sort of a close sister of the Telnet activity. And then we see some other activity associated with the 17788. We saw this as the BitTorrent peer-to-peer network.
Yep. BitTorrent type of activity.
9101 UDP, and that pretty much covers it here. So, looking at the number of sources that are scanning on port 23 TCP, at the end of July, we had peaked up around 70,000 sources per hour that we were observing, and that's been decaying downward. So despite the fact that it's still at the top of the list in terms of the number of sources probing, it's actually tapered down to on the order of about perhaps 2/3 of what we had seen before, around 45,000 sources per hour. And if we were to look at the aggregate across the day, I would estimate probably on the order of about 100,000 sources that basically we happen to run across on the network. Now, globally, that's probably a reasonably larger number in terms of the participants in this activity. So a lot of devices out there being turned into bots and being used in recruitment activity. And in fact, one of the other things that we should consider is that in a botnet, they may only have a small segment that's actually doing recruiting. I like to think of it as drafting, actually, because they don't get a choice. They draft them into the botnet, and then the botnet actually gets used for other activities, and a lot of these are used for commercialized denial of service attack activity. Now, I read an article, since we're on the denial of service attack, I read an article recently that some activity, actually Krebs actually had an article on this. Brian Krebs had posted that basically some activities were done to basically block the payment to some of the booter and stressor services. And so this may become a little bit of a deterrent to some of these commercialized denial of service attack activities. I think PayPal has pulled that. Yeah. So there's still the Bitcoin path that would exist for some of these others, but hopefully more resistance will be able to be generated as time goes on. So we'll see if this continues to go downward. Hopefully it will.
Well, at least it raises the bar of entry for actually being a user of these services. I mean, if you don't have if you're not familiar enough with Bitcoin, it's not just, most people can't just go ahead and buy it. Mm-hmm. Most people can just sign up for a PayPal account or use their parents' Bitcoin, PayPal account. Mm-hmm. So glad that's being dealt with.
Right. Well, and if they go on to use a credit card, it's at least a little more traceable, so they can start.
Oh, definitely.
Unless it's a prepaid credit card.
That's true.
Well, all right. Okay, so I thought I'd just show you the daily reconnaissance index. We haven't taken a look at this in a little while. This is showing the last 400 days of activity, and what we're measuring is basically a relative index in terms of the number of sources that are doing probing, also contributing basically the number of probes that are associated with those sources. So the red portion being the number of probes, the blue portion being associated with the number of sources. Now this had been normalized when it was originally created several years ago, so that the number of sources relative to the number of probes was relatively an equal contribution. I think when we originally generated this, the number of probes were up around 7. Basically an index was up around 70. It had been down in the basically low 20s or even actually in the teens for some period of time, but as this Internet of Things has climbed up, we've seen that this index climbing up again as well over the long term. So in any case, not really any big changes in activity. We did see sort of a little bit of a drop, indicating some activities had basically been suspended, and we do see a little bit of a climbing activity associated with the number of sources and contributing to this as well. So again, nothing really terribly surprising there. So that's our show for today. We'd like to thank you for joining us, and if you'd like to get in touch with us, you can email us at AT&T ThreatTraq at list.att.com, and you can find the AT&T ThreatTraq program on the AT&T Tech channel. It's on YouTube as well as on iTunes. Just look techchannel.att.com and you'll see the program there. You can follow us on Twitter. Our handle is at ATT Security, and I'd like to thank you, Josh, for joining us today. It's good to see you again. Thank you, John. Thanks, Matt. We'll be back next week with a new episode, and until then, keep your network safe.